Hello, welcome to the first series of our rivers revision videos that I've prepared for you. Over the next few videos you'll see that these slides come from a website called coolgeography.co.uk by Rob Gamesby, and you can go on there and you can look at the full PowerPoints and some worksheets and things like that. You will have seen these lessons before, and so hopefully I'm just going to go through them to explain a few things to you. So the first thing we're going to look at is the basics behind rivers. To understand the processes in rivers, you need to understand the shape of a river. So rivers obviously start off up in highland areas, so high up areas, and we call that the source. Okay, so the start of a river is called the source. And the source of the river, as I said, is normally quite high up, and that's because rivers flow downhill by the power of gravity, or the influence of gravity, and as they go downhill they gain in size and they gain in depth and in width. Eventually they become quite a wide river at the bottom, or what we call the mouth, which is the end near the sea or near a lake. On this diagram here you can see a number of different features of a river drainage basin. So the first thing I'm going to point out to you is this here, so valley sides. We are going to talk quite a lot about valleys. Now, in geography questions, you're sometimes asked about describing the valley or the river valley, and sometimes you're asked to describe the river channel. Now, there is a difference between a valley and a channel, and I'll explain what those are in a few moments, but there is a distinct difference, and so we need to understand that. So we've got the valley sides. We've also got a confluence. So where two rivers meet, it doesn't matter what size the river is. It could be two big rivers, two small rivers. It's called a confluence. So that's where two things meet, or two rivers meet. You've also got the watershed. Okay, so here, which is shown by the dotted lines on either side of the valleys. Now the watershed is basically the last point on a range of mountains where water can drain into a certain drainage basin. So anything that falls on, so for example on this line here, anything that falls on the left hand side, okay, will fall into another drainage basin. Anything that falls on the right hand side of this dotted line will fall into this drainage basin that you can see on the screen. There's not many questions about this at GCSE, but it is important to understand what a watershed is in the basic terms. We've also got tributaries. You'll have heard this word before, and these contribute water to the main stream, and that's, we think, where the word tributary means, because they contribute to water. And so obviously the more tributaries you get, the more water you get into the river. The final thing that I'll show you is this, so the water table. So the water table is an actual point underneath the ground where water will have a natural level. So you will have a water table across the landscape, but across the landscape you'll get different heights of water table. Now, it's easy to spot where a water table is when you've got a river, because the river is normally, or the top of the river is normally the top of the water table. So in theory, if you were to keep on digging across through this river here, and you dug straight across into this mountain or this hill, at the same level of the height of the river, that'd be where water would be under the ground. So it's permanently saturated rock. Now obviously that rock will get less saturated depending on different conditions, and we'll talk about those when we look at flooding. But basically, if you get dry conditions, the water table will drop. If you get wetter conditions, the water table will rise. So the higher the water table is, the more risk of flooding. Going back to what I was saying about valleys and channels. So the valley is the bits of the river, or the river profile, where you've not got water. So if you were to describe the valley of a river, you're describing the bits where the water isn't going to be. If you were to describe the channel of a river, you're describing this bit here. So the channel is the bit where the water actually is. When we go out on field work, or you may have already been out on your field work, you will know the difference because you'll be able to see it actually in the landscape. But just know that the difference is that the valley doesn't have water in it. It's the area that doesn't have the water, but the channel is the bit that has the water. And when we look at the next slide, it'll make a little bit more sense as to what you'd need to describe on a question. So if we are to look at rivers, they have what we call long and cross profiles. A long profile is the profile along the length of the river. That's how I remember it. So long profile along the river. A cross profile is looking as if you were stood in the river and you were looking up where the river's coming from. So that's looking across the river. The way I remember it as well is if you are going to have a cake for your birthday or for a celebration, or just because you want a cake, then the long profile of the cake would be the whole cake from start to finish. The cross profile of the cake would be when you cut it in half and then you see the different layers and the different things that are inside the cake. So that's how you can kind of remember it. In the exam, you might be asked to describe the long profile, which is what you can currently see on the screen. So this river here, the long profile, you can see it starts up quite high, and then the height drops, and then it gets obviously to about sea level, which we call 0 meters above sea level. So that's the long profile. So it starts off steep, okay? You can imagine if you're in the mountains, it's obviously quite steep in the mountains. And then as you get further down, it's not as steep anymore. It gets a bit gentler, but there's still a bit of a slope. And then you get nearer to the sea and it's normally quite flat. A way to look at this is around school, we are in the bottom profile of a river. So down here. I know we're not near the sea. We're about 35 miles from the sea. But we are in a flatter part of the land. So we're in the lower part of the river. This bit here, where it's a bit more, I suppose, slopey, would be like going up to around Oldham or I suppose Ashton Way. So you've got slightly more hills. This bit here, the top part of the river profile, or the upper course, is similar to going up into the Pennines, into the Peak District, where it's a lot more hilly, a lot more steep slopes. And so this is the long profile from start to finish. And so you would be expected to be able to describe how it changes or what one part of the river profile would look like compared to the other. So we do have different parts of a river. So in the upper course of the river, so the upper part, which is up in the highland areas, that's why we call it the upper area, you can see that the channel and the valley in this cross section here is very, very steep-sided V-shaped valleys. And you can see that the channel itself, remember that's where only the water is, the channel, the blue triangle there, is very narrow and very shallow. Up in the upper part of the river, you get very, very big rocks, and that's because not much erosion has taken place to them. Up here, you've got mainly boulders and really angular material. As I said, that's because it's just been eroded from the landscape, and we'll talk more about erosion on our next video. So it's just been eroded, it's just been taken out, it's very angular, large particles. A lot of the transportation that's going on up here is traction. Again, we'll talk about it later, but it's the rolling of rocks because it's so big, it's been pushed, but only normally during high flow conditions. So we're talking floods or when you've got really, really excessive rainfall. And as I said, it's really, really V-shaped. So up in the upper valley, you get things like waterfalls, V-shaped valleys. And those are the features that we'll be looking at in another few videos. In the middle reaches, or the middle course of the river, you can see that the valley shape, so that's the bit where the water isn't actually touching, it's a lot wider now, the valley. The slopes are a lot more gentle, it's not as steep. It's still steep in parts, but not as steep. And the channel, the water bit, is a lot wider and a lot deeper. And that's because erosion has taken place. And because erosion's taken place, it's made it wider and deeper. And also as erosion takes place and the river actually starts to go down towards the sea, so you can see here that it's gone down a little bit, it's lost height, then what happens is the sides start to crumble and start to break down. And so that's what creates the wider, more, I suppose, U-shape compared to the previous upper valley. We'll talk about what type of process is going on in here later, but again, now that the particles are starting to erode, you got lots smaller particles. So instead of having boulders and big, really angular material like in the upper valley, in the middle valley, it's been eroded a bit. You're starting to get more rounded and, I suppose, smaller particles as well. As you get further and further down into the lower reaches or the lower course of the valley, you can see now that the valley is almost not even there. It's very wide. It's not a deep valley anymore, but the channel is really wide and really, really deep. And that's because more erosion's taken place to make it into a wider, deeper river channel and also river valley. Down here as well, the material is really rounded and really, really small. Sometimes you can't even see the material in the lower reaches, especially near the sea and the ocean. What you tend to get as well is a change in colour in the river as you go from upper to lower. And that's because in the upper valley, the material is so big that it doesn't really mix with the water and it doesn't create almost like a muddy looking water. So you get quite clear streams and nice upper course streams. As you get to the middle reaches, because it's starting to break down a little bit, the material, the river starts to get a bit more murky and a bit muddy, or it looks muddy, and that's because you're getting smaller particles in the river. But you've still got quite big particles in the middle reaches. And then in the lower reaches, it's really muddy. It's really it looks dirty, the water. It's not. It's just loads and loads of material that's been eroded away into really, really small particles that are floating in the river. So that's how the river changes over time. As I said, you could be asked any type of question about this. Normally they're about 4-mark questions. You could be given a diagram just like this and asked to describe the changes in the valley. You could be asked the changes in the channel. You could be asked to describe how it changes, how the long profile changes of a river. There's many, many different things that you could be asked. The main important thing to remember here, though, is that the river does start off in the upper reaches very steep conditions, very steep valleys, very narrow valleys. The gradient or the river profile is very steep as well. As you get to the middle reaches, it starts to flatten out. It's a lot less steep. The river channel is a lot wider. It's deeper. The river valley is also wider and a little less deep than it used to be. And then finally in the lower reaches, it's flatter, it's wider valley, it's much flatter valley, much wider channel, and much deeper channel. So that's how the river changes over time. In my next video,